we live in crazy times which make Marx actual, but for this very reason we should criticize Marx. What do I mean by this? The problem with Marx is that precisely where he was right to such an extent that he couldn't even imagine how right he is. And that's why he did. No, I will give you a simple example. You know the famous lines from Communist Manifesto that with capitalism everything solid melt into thin air, all stable forms are dissolved and so on, all stable hierarchies and so on. But would Marx have even imagined where we are today? For Marx, sexual gender coordinates were still stable. That even that is today experienced as something fluid and so on. Or even nature itself. For Marx, nature was still, in the typical modern European way, with all its storms, wild things, and so on, the stable background of our being. We humans are Promethean, we change things, and so on. But somehow Marx still counted that nature is this vast reservoir of forces and so on, is somehow strong enough to incorporate or to neutralize the destructive effects of our activity. Now, as we all know, living in the era called Anthropocene and so on, you see, Marx was much more right. He should have also added in Communist Manifesto not only social forms, but even what we perceive as natural forms. Life on Earth, our gender, sexual identities are much more fluid, unnatural, and so on and so on. So this, I think, compels us to think more radically, to question many presuppositions. Another nasty thing, I want to provoke you politically. Marx mentions in Communist Manifesto also their all old patriarchal relations are, with developed capitalism, are undermined, rendered fluid, and so on and so on. And that's why I think, with all my respect for transgender movement and so on, that's why I am not surprised that transgender movement is so immensely popular among great corporate figures of the United States. You remember when month before Trump was elected, I mean, this is, I think, one of the reasons why he won. The main topic of big left liberal media like New York Times and so on, what to do with transgender toilets. Is it 2, 3, is it single toilet, and so on and so on. And what made me a little bit suspicious is that all of them, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, name them, all of them fanatically, even the worst capitalist, like who is now, I forgot, after Steve Jobs, the boss of Apple, Tim Cook or who, they all fully supported it. I mean, we should accept it, yes, of course, but that's another topic. Transgender, Me Too. But they are not, I claim, inherently revolutionary. They fit perfectly the dynamic of late capitalist subjectivity, with this infinite plasticity and so on and so on. That's why I also have a problem, although personally we are in good relations, with my big philosophical nemesis, Judith Butler. I agree with her. She gives the correct description of what is happening today. You know, we no longer have, or less and less, this binary logic, predetermined sexual roles. We rediscover, recreate, repeat, reconstruct, invent our identities. My only problem is, what's so revolutionary about it? My reproach to her is that in some sense, she is simply describing modern late capitalist, typical modern late capitalist subjectivity. We live in a unique era where today, if we can construct this in a naive way, I simplify it. Today, ideology, and I don't mean a personalized ideology, but in the most elementary sense, when you're growing up and all the time later, what society is telling you to be, in a very naive way. What does it expect from you? My God, it's no longer obey your father, sacrifice yourself. It's what I ironically like to call spiritualized hedonism or enlightened Western Buddhism. Basically, the message is there are no higher causes worth sacrificing for. Enjoy life, but not in a stupid sense. Look into yourself, recreate yourself, explore your potentials, and so on and so on. A very simple, stupid example. Half a century ago and more, a very traditional, stupid point, simplistic, with regard to promiscuity. If you were a man or a wife, promiscuous, sleeping around with others, it was considered pathological, something to be interpreted. You know, the idea was, what are you running from? Why this fear from stable relations, whatever? Did you have Oedipal problems, blah, blah. Today, they told me it's the opposite. I'm not joking. If you are faithful to your wife or husband, you'll get, oh my God, you have a traumatic fixation. This has to be... What is hysteria at its most elementary? It's an undermining of interpellation. By interpellation, I mean this mechanism elaborated by Louis Althusser of ideological identity, like society or figures of authority are telling you who you are, your symbolic identity. You are my wife, you are professor, you are pupil, you are revolutionary, you are a communist, whatever, and you recognize yourself in it. But the basic hysterical question is, but why am I what you are saying that I am? This elementary doubt, it's much more interesting skepticism. It's not about reality. Are things really like that? The question is, who am I? Am I really? You know, it's the old Juliet from Romeo and Juliet question, what's in that name? Am I that name? And so on and so on.
In his monumentous work, Adventures in Transcendental Materialism, Adrian Johnston identifies a peculiar Spinozism in the work of thinkers like Karen Barad.
What are the conditions of impossibilities of living, dying, and voids produced by techno-scientific projects and other forms of colonial conquest?
Elizabeth Gross.
Knowledges are weapons, tools in the struggle of power over what counts as truth, over what can be used to create new systems, forces, regimes, techniques, none of which are indifferent to power. Now, this is not to say that those discourses aspiring to the status of truth and to be included in the canon of knowledge are not really true. I'm not suggesting that. But only that truth itself, which requires onerous conditions for statements to be included, is always already an effective power and a condition of power's more effective operation.
Bruno Latour.
So the more globalized you were, the more, in French we use mondialisation as well as globalization, the more diversity of views, cultural aspect, and attention and attachment you had. But now, since the last 30 years, and in my view, largely because what happened to the planetary system, what we mean by globalization is exact reverse. We mean by globalization a provincial extension of a very, very, very tiny numbers of standards about how to live, what it is to be a subject, what's to have a law, what it is to calculate your interest, and so on and so forth, which have been spreading all over the planet and eating up at the diversity and multiplicity of life forms. And when I say life forms, I'm not talking only about humans, I'm only also talking about all of the animates with which we collaborate, so to speak. So when you say, I'm against globalization, we never know which one is it. Is it the one which increased the numbers of diversity, the amount of diversity, or is it the one that actually decreased it? And that creates, in my view, a sort of disorientation. And it is this disorientation that explains the conservative revolution.
Rosie Bredati.
So a whole machinery of anxiety, discursive anxiety and imaginary anxiety, which I would fight with heavy doses of Spinozist affirmative ethics, ethics of joy, and I hope we have enough time to talk about this, although it wasn't really the core of today's lecture. Quickly, in this context, I mentioned rapidly before that the spectrum, the context of this is cognitive capitalism. It's still good old capitalism selling us commodities. Commodities which are quantitative proliferations of objects that we don't need.
And Jane Bennett.
In other words, normal perception is biased towards instrumentality rather than vibrancy, simplification rather than a subtle reception.
Who are all important for this work. He critiques these thinkers as attempting to stretch, quote, received concepts of agency, action, and freedom, sometimes to the breaking point, by following a clever response to the Cartesian cogito. Simply put, the I think therefore I am, which is perhaps the primogenitor of the Enlightenment subject, comes with the Spinozist realization that the I is not necessarily needed for the construction, since existence can precede thought without any, quote, I.
What are your thoughts when facing an opponent?
There is no opponent.
And why is that?
Because the word I does not exist.
Through what is called speculative realism or new materialism, which are, quote, open methodologies, both keenly sensitive to the archival issues about what can be considered inside and outside, for at root they attempt to challenge the habit of only referring to issues as to how they relate to humans and being attentive to non-human forms of subjectivity. Johnston also names other thinkers as well, Mascherai, William Connolly, Manuel Delanda.
Brodel, for instance, calls cities accelerators of historical time, in the sense that, for instance, in the feudal period, you can see one history going at a particular speed in feudal lands, whereas in those towns that were growing in the middle of feudalism, history was being accelerated, and all kinds of things, for instance, money and banks, stock markets, in a variety of institutions that we now consider modern, and that many times we think of them as being born in the Renaissance, were actually born right in the middle of feudalism, which for Brodel illustrates the idea that there is not one flow of history, but several flows going at different speeds. And in this differential speeds of urban history versus rural history, and in different urban centers going at faster speeds than in others, you can many of the secrets of the millennium can be found.
Michael Hardit and Antonio Negri are all, to varying degrees and in different manners, representatives of this rival Spinozism in today's multidisciplinary theoretical landscape, he says. Utilizing social constructivist ideas as a way of overcoming the Spinozist, what is called vitalistic and biological determinism, these movements are critical of how abstractions made in the sciences turn into cultural realities.
Now, once you know to look out for it, this stuff pops up all over the place because it feeds that appetite we have for certainty, right? So maybe you want to assure someone that something poses no health risk. Now, this is quite old and very blatant, but these days, scientism takes a different form. We see fewer lab coats and more numbers, more data. So maybe you want to generate some press. You could write an article about how a Google Doodle distracted people at work and cost the world 166 million pounds in lost productivity. Now, that's a very precise figure. It's not 165, it's 166. Now, I don't know how this was measured or what the number is relative to, presumably the bizarro world where people sit at desks all day and never take breaks. But the data makes it sound sort of plausible, right? It's very precise. Invoking neuroscience is one of my favorites. If you mention fMRI or the brain, you could pretty much say whatever you want. And you can end up with weird things like this article about math anxiety, which we learn, it turns out, is not just a fear of numbers, but is a measurable emotional reaction involving something about the brain's hypothalamus. Now, this sounds very scientific, but I'm sort of troubled by articles like this, because to me they're symptomatic of a culture in which if you cannot measure something, it is not real. And if you don't describe something with scientific language, people won't pay attention to you. But do we really want to live in a world where we require brain scans in order to feel empathy for someone who struggles with math? I don't either. I don't either. So those are a few examples of scientism, trying to create the appearance of science without the essence of science, trying to feed that appetite we have for certainty. And if you do this, it can let you end debate or sell something or just generally kind of have an air of authority. And because it can do these things so effectively, scientism is alluring. It's very tempting for all kinds of people,
especially when results-oriented investment structures rely upon objectification itself to clearly mark its so-called progress.
We have no data suggesting the Japanese have developed a robot with offensive capability.
You're paid to think, Mr. Scientist. National security is our job.
Again, for the sake of brevity, I am simplifying, but crudely put, the task of all these methodologies is to, instead of objectifying, they attempt to reverse this trend by subjectifying everything to the point where the efficacy of holding on to the concept of subjectivity itself is questionable. Some dispense with the notion of subjectivity altogether, since it is inevitably an anthropocentric construct, while others attempt to be attentive to the trans or post-human forms of subjectivity. Jane Bennett attempts to highlight how objects have a positive, productive power of their own, while seeking to dissipate the ontotheological binaries of life and matter, human and animal, will and determination, and organic and inorganic, using arguments and other rhetorical means to induce in human bodies an aesthetic, affective openness to material vitality, and to sketch a style of political analysis that can better account for the contributions of non-human actants. This is something we can find in Buddhism as well. In an attempt to demarcate the distinction between Hegelian pan-logoism from what he perceives as being an anachronistic misinterpretation that sees Hegel in terms of panpsychism or vitalism, Johnston critiques what he sees as a pervading underlying neo-Spinozism espoused in various ways by these authors. Johnston refers to Lacan regarding a long-standing philosophical problem that initially arose during the discussions between German idealists to mark how these issues are not so much solved as allowed to fall by the wayside over the course of historical time. Johnston's strategy is then to work to find what he sees are the core Hegelian realizations within Spinoza's philosophy itself. Quoting Johnston, Spinoza's greatest breakthrough, arguably, is his realization of the mutual exclusivity between infinitude and transcendence. What is transcendent cannot be infinite, and vice versa. If something stands separately over and above other things, then this something is limited, namely rendered finite by whatever subsists beyond or outside its own transcendent sphere. Inversely, but correlatively, if something is genuinely instead of spuriously infinite, it neither is external to anything else, nor is anything else external to it. Hence, the true infinite directly and necessarily entails strict immanence insofar as it fundamentally excludes any and every transcendence, according to Hegel's imminent critique of Spinoza's rationalist substance metaphysics, with the latter radical monism inextricably intertwined with the musings on the infinite. What Spinoza rightly prohibits for the infinity of God or nature as the one all of ultimate being, he implicitly and wrongly judged even by his own ideas and standards, permits for the reflective position of intellectual intuition as external reflection. To explain this, for Johnston, these neo-Spinozists do not fully appreciate how contemplation stands on a transcendent meta-level above whatever is material or real, thus implicitly making contemplation something immaterial or ideal. He explains that regardless of any ontological speculations, we cannot mistake the human capacity to leap for flying itself. Johnston's grievance is that one must distinguish between anti-humanism and anti-subjectivism, for which he finds the main culprit to be an arguably anachronistic interpretation of Hegel's corpus in John Hippolyte's Logic and Existence, which is foundational to both Deleuze and the following neo-Spinozist tradition. Instead, Johnston affirms a reading of Hegel that is found precisely on the grounds of finitude, a transcendental subjectivity which ultimately goes against the post-colonial hesitancy that, quote, all transcendental cultural logic is, at its heart, imperialistic, which certain readings of Hegel evoke. The primary contribution here is that the concept of finitude is necessarily connected to the perspective of particularity in a way that is unlike Spinoza's monadic spiritualism, because a spiritual event only happens with a splitting self-negation, the position that the absolute is fragmented simultaneously affirms both finitude and particularity. This is the philosophy behind the greatest story ever told, explored in the next section.
Tell us, is it against our law for us to pay taxes to the Roman Emperor or not?
Show me a silver coin.
Jesus, speak to us.
Whose face and name are these on it?
Caesar!
Then give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.